Chapter 1. The Flames That Changed Everything. The sky was burning. From orbit, the city of Eldoria Prime had once gleamed like a celestial beacon, its crystalline spires stretching toward the heavens, reflecting the golden light of the planet's twin suns. It was a place of grandeur and peace, a kingdom built on centuries of diplomatic power and prosperity. Now, it was a smoldering graveyard. Explosions rattled the air, sending shockwaves through the ruined streets as towering structures crumbled into flaming debris. The night sky was veiled in thick smoke, the once pristine avenues now littered with bodies, wreckage, and the echoes of a city that had once thrived. Ethan Voss, former soldier, current mercenary, navigated the wreckage with steady determination, his boots crunching over shattered glass and scorched stone. The smell of burning metal and charred flesh filled the air, but he had long since learned to ignore the scent of war. This was supposed to be a simple contract, a routine escort mission for a Zyran noble, nothing more than a glorified babysitting job. A few days in Eldoria Prime, some easy credits, and then back to the void, where he belonged. But now he was stranded in a dying city, and the only thing keeping him alive was his training and sheer stubbornness. The echoes of war. The attack had come without warning. One moment, Eldoria Prime had been alive with celebration, hosting a galactic summit between the Zyran Dominion and its neighboring factions. The next, the sky had been ripped apart by an orbital bombardment, so fierce that it had turned night into day. The first wave of destruction had leveled entire districts. The second had sent troop carriers flooding into the city, alien invaders clad in black armor, their weapons firing indiscriminately into crowds of fleeing civilians. Ethan had fought in 100 battles, but this was something else. This was annihilation. He had barely managed to escape the initial assault, forced to abandon his ship when the docking bays were reduced to molten slag. Now, all he could do was survive long enough to find a way off this burning world. But as he moved through the ruined streets, his instincts screamed at him he wasn't alone. A sound, a weak, desperate cry drifted through the air, barely audible over the distant thunder of collapsing buildings. Ethan froze. He wasn't a hero. Not anymore. He had spent years in the outer reaches, taking jobs that paid well and didn't ask questions. His days of rushing into burning buildings to save strangers were supposed to be over. But something about the voice raw, filled with terror and pain, made his pulse quicken. He sighed. Damn it. The girl in the flames. The cry led him to a half-collapsed palace structure, its once majestic pillars now blackened and fractured. The royal district had been hit the hardest. Whoever had attacked the city had wanted to wipe out the Zyran leadership first. Ethan moved quickly, weaving through scorched corridors and broken statues of ancient Zyran rulers. The air was thick with heat and ash, and each step sent embers swirling through the ruins. Then, he saw her. A young woman, pinned beneath a fallen beam, her body half covered in dust and blood. Her silver-white hair, streaked with soot, clung to her face as she struggled weakly, trying to free herself. Her eyes vivid violet, burning with defiance, locked onto his the moment he entered. "Help me," she rasped, her voice raw from smoke inhalation. Ethan didn't hesitate. He knelt beside her, assessing the wreckage. The beam pinning her leg was massive, but it was weakened by the heat. If he could get the right leverage, he could move it. "This is gonna hurt," he warned. She gave him a shaky nod. With a grunt, Ethan braced himself and heaved, muscles straining as he pushed against the molten-hot debris. The beam shifted slightly, enough for the girl to cry out in pain, but then, with a final, desperate effort, he shoved it aside completely. She gasped, freed at last. Ethan reached out, grabbing her arm to pull her to her feet. And that's when he saw it. A golden insignia, barely visible beneath the torn fabric of her dress. His stomach dropped. She wasn't just any civilian. She was Zyran royalty. And that meant he had just made things a whole lot worse for himself. A royal problem. The girl wavered but remained standing, her breaths coming in short, labored gasps. Ethan stared at her for a long moment. "Your nobility," he said flatly. She exhaled sharply, steadying herself. "Princess Alira Valzyran," she admitted, brushing a strand of silver hair from her soot-streaked face. Ethan muttered a curse. "Great. Of course you are." Alira tilted her head, her violet eyes narrowing. You don't seem pleased. You're a walking death sentence, princess, he replied. Every bounty hunter in the system's gonna be looking for you. Her gaze darkened. Then I suggest we move before they find me. Ethan had to admit she had a point. They were still deep in enemy-occupied territory, and if the invaders had targeted the royal family, they would be searching for survivors. Staying here? Not an option. Ethan sighed. All right, let's get you out of here. Alira nodded. Do you have a plan? Plan's simple, Ethan said, reloading his blaster. We get to the lower levels, find a ship, and get the hell off this rock before anyone realizes you're still breathing. Alira hesitated. And what do you want in return? Ethan smirked. A paycheck would be nice. She studied him carefully, then nodded. If you get me off this planet alive, I will see that you are rewarded beyond your wildest dreams. Ethan raised an eyebrow. Yeah? I've heard that before. She took a step closer, her voice quiet but firm. I am the last surviving heir to the Zyran throne. If I fall, my people are lost. If you help me escape, you won't just be saving me. You'll be saving an entire empire. Ethan sighed. Yeah, no pressure, right? Alira smiled faintly. None at all. Then, from behind them shouting, Ethan turned sharply, his instincts flaring. Through the billowing smoke, he saw figures approaching black-armored soldiers, their weapons gleaming under the firelight. The enemy had found them. Alira tensed. They know I'm alive. Ethan cocked his blaster, stepping in front of her. Yeah, he muttered. And they're about to find out they made a mistake. Chapter 2. Escape through fire and blood. The city shuddered under another distant explosion, sending ripples of heat and dust through the ruins. The enemy was closing in. Ethan gritted his teeth, gripping his blaster rifle as the first of the black-armored soldiers moved into sight through the billowing smoke. Their visors gleamed red in the firelight, their plasma weapons humming with lethal energy. They weren't here to capture. They were here to kill. Alira stood beside him, her silver hair streaked with soot. Her violet eyes narrowed as she watched their attackers advance. She looked calm, but Ethan wasn't fooled. The slight tension in her posture, the way her fingers curled just slightly, told him everything she was ready to fight. Stay behind me, Ethan muttered, raising his rifle. Alira scoffed. I don't think so. Before Ethan could respond, she stepped forward, her hand snapping outward in a fluid motion. For a split second, he thought she was unarmed until the air around her hand shimmered. A blade of crackling blue energy burst to life in her palm, humming with power. Ethan's eyes widened. What the hell, Dash? Alira lunged. She was faster than he expected, moving with the precise grace of someone who had been trained since birth for combat. The first soldier barely had time to react before she sliced through his weapon, the energy blade searing through metal like it was made of paper. The soldier stumbled back, but she was already moving, twisting around to deliver a sharp, devastating strike across his chest. He dropped instantly. Ethan barely had time to process before more soldiers rushed forward. All right then, he muttered, lifting his rifle. Let's dance. He squeezed the trigger, sending a hail of plasma fire into the oncoming enemy. One soldier dropped, another took cover, and Ethan used the brief distraction to grab Alira by the arm. Nice trick, princess, he growled. But we need to move. Alira shot him a look but didn't argue. Together, they raced through the ruined city, ducking into side streets and weaving through the debris of what had once been one of the grandest capitals in the galaxy. But the enemy wasn't giving up. The soldiers were everywhere, their black armor glinting in the firelight as they systematically swept the ruins, hunting for survivors. Hunting for her. Through the ashen streets, Ethan led Alira through a narrow alley, pressing his back against the scorched wall as a patrol passed. He held his breath, gripping his rifle tightly, every muscle in his body coiled. Alira stood close beside him, so close he could feel the heat radiating off her skin. Her breathing was controlled, but there was an unmistakable edge of tension in the way she held herself. The soldiers passed without noticing them. Ethan exhaled slowly. We need to find a way out of this sector before they realize where we're going. Alira nodded. Do you have a ship? Not anymore, Ethan muttered. Docking Bay got bombed to hell. She cursed softly in Zyran, a lyrical but sharp sound. Then we need to find a transport. There's a military outpost 2 kilometers from here, she said. They might still have evacuation ships. Ethan frowned. And if they don't? Alira's expression hardened. Then we take one. Ethan huffed. You're really gonna get me killed, aren't you? She gave him a small, amused smirk. Not if you keep up. Ethan shook his head, but he couldn't deny it. She was something else. A desperate gamble. They moved swiftly, keeping to the shadows, avoiding open streets where the enemy's air patrols could spot them. The city was in ruins, entire districts leveled. The once pristine marble streets now buried under rubble and corpses. They passed makeshift barricades, abandoned weapons, and the occasional shattered military vehicle, its crew long dead. The Zyran forces had fought, but they had never stood a chance. Alira said nothing as they walked, but Ethan caught the way she glanced at the bodies, her expression tight. You knew them? He asked after a moment. She hesitated. Then, softly, some of them. Ethan exhaled. War was cruel, but this was a massacre, and she had lost everything. Ethan had been a soldier long enough to recognize the look in her eyes. The hollow, aching grief of someone who had just watched their world burn. And yet, she wasn't breaking. If anything, she looked more determined. Ethan respected that, even if he had no idea how the hell he was going to get her out of this alive. The outpost. By the time they reached the military outpost, the night sky had turned deep red, the fires of the city reflecting against the thick smoke overhead. The outpost was damaged but intact, its walls scorched, its defensive turrets still half-functional. Ethan peered through his rifle's scoped sight, scanning the compound. No movement, he muttered. Either it's abandoned, or it's a trap. Alira straightened. There's only one way to find out. Ethan sighed. I was afraid you'd say that. They approached carefully, weapons drawn, moving through the shattered remains of the entrance hall. The interior was eerily quiet. Too quiet. Ethan's gut twisted. Then a soft noise. He turned sharply, but Alira was faster. She moved like lightning, flipping forward into a fluid strike, her energy blade igniting as she lunged toward the shadows. A figure stumbled backward, barely avoiding her blade. Ethan raised his rifle, only to freeze. The figure wasn't an enemy. It was a young Zyran soldier, barely more than a kid, his uniform torn and bloodied, his face streaked with soot. His eyes widened when he saw Alira. Your Highness Dash, he gasped. Alira stepped forward. Are there others? The soldier swallowed, then nodded. A few of us survived. We're hiding in the hangar. But there's a problem. Ethan stiffened. What kind of problem? The soldier's expression darkened. They found us first. And then, from deeper inside the base, a gunshot. Ethan and Alira locked eyes. Then, in perfect unison, they ran toward the fight. Chapter 3. The Weight of a Throne. The echoes of gunfire reverberated through the ruined outpost, each shot a stark reminder that their fight was far from over. Ethan and Alira moved swiftly through the shattered hallways, their boots crunching against broken glass and spent shell casings. The young Zyran soldier, his name was Tyrion, led them deeper inside, his movements quick but wary, his eyes darting toward every darkened doorway. This place was supposed to be an evacuation point, Tyrion said, his voice low but urgent. But when the attack started, most of the high-ranking officers were already dead. The rest of us, those who weren't killed in the first wave, gathered here. Ethan glanced at Alira. Her expression remained unreadable, but he could see the tension in the way her hands tightened into fists. She had lost everything tonight. Her home, her people, her family. And now, whatever remained of her loyal soldiers were trapped in a death trap. How many of you are left? She asked, her voice steady. Tyrion hesitated. A dozen, maybe. We lost contact with some when the enemy breached the lower levels. Alira's jaw tightened. We need to reach them. Now. Ethan nodded. Lead the way, kid. Tyrion didn't waste time. He turned sharply, moving down a side corridor, his rifle raised as he guided them toward the hangar bay. The further they went, the stronger the stench of blood and burned flesh became. This place had already been a slaughterhouse. And it wasn't over yet. The last stand of the Zyran soldiers. They reached the hangar doors, and Tyrion froze, raising a clenched fist. Ethan recognized the silent command, instantly hold position. He and Alira pressed against the charred wall, their weapons at the ready. Tyrion exhaled slowly, then carefully peeked around the corner. A flash of red energy seared past his face. Tyrion jerked back, cursing. Ethan didn't hesitate. He leaned out just enough to see the battle unfolding inside. The hangar, once a gleaming departure bay filled with state-of-the-art Zyran transport ships, was now a war zone. A small group of Zyran soldiers had taken shelter behind stacked supply crates, their uniforms tattered, their weapons nearly depleted. They were outnumbered heavily. The enemy had them pinned down, moving in from multiple angles, their black armor glinting beneath the emergency lights. One soldier, a Zyran officer, judging by the gold insignia on his shattered breastplate, was slumped against a crate, clutching a bleeding wound at his side. His breathing was ragged, but his grip on his weapon was steady. They were losing, and they knew it. Illyra inhaled sharply beside him. Her golden eyes burned. "We have to help them," she said, already stepping forward. Ethan grabbed her wrist. "Hold on, princess," he muttered. "There's at least a dozen of them, maybe more. If we go in blind, we're dead before we even get close." Illyra shot him a glare, but Tyrion quickly cut in. "There's a secondary control panel just ahead," he said, motioning toward a damaged console along the far wall. "It controls the blast doors and security turrets. If we can reactivate it, we can turn the fight in our favor." Ethan nodded. "All right, then that's our play." Illyra hesitated for only a second, then she exhaled. "Fine, but be quick." Tyrion gave a sharp nod, moving toward the panel while Ethan positioned himself behind a stack of overturned machinery, his rifle ready. Illyra crouched beside him, her energy blade pulsing in her grip. Then, Ethan smirked. "Let's make some noise." Battle for the hangar. Ethan fired first. The shot tore through the enemy ranks, striking the nearest soldier square in the chest. Before the others could react, Illyra was already on the move. She darted forward with inhuman speed, her blade a blur of blue light as she cut through armor and bone alike. The enemy scrambled to reposition, turning their weapons toward her, which was exactly what Ethan wanted. He took advantage of the distraction, firing into the group with deadly precision, each shot dropping another enemy. Then, a sudden whirring sound. The outpost's defensive turrets jerked to life. Tyrion had reactivated them. The automated guns rotated sharply, locking onto the invaders before unleashing a deadly hail of energy rounds. The battle shifted instantly. The enemy, caught between a furious princess, a sniper, and automated turrets, began to fall apart. It was over in seconds. The last soldier tried to run. Illyra cut him down before he took 2 steps. Silence fell over the hangar. The surviving Zyran soldiers slowly emerged from their cover, their faces pale with exhaustion and disbelief. Then, their gazes landed on Illyra. One by one, they dropped to one knee. "Your Highness," the wounded officer gasped. "You're alive." Ethan exhaled sharply, lowering his rifle. Yeah, this was about to get complicated. The crown weighs heavy. Illyra didn't move at first. She just stood there, her blade still humming, her silver hair streaked with blood and soot, her expression unreadable. Then, finally, she stepped forward. "Who is your commanding officer?" she asked, her tone firm. The wounded officer, despite the pain in his expression, bowed his head. "I am, Your Highness, Captain Vaylor Reese." "Status?" Vaylor swallowed hard. "There is no chain of command left. The council is gone. The royal family. We thought they had been eradicated." His voice shook, just slightly. "But you're here." Illyra nodded once. "I am." Ethan could feel the weight of the moment settling over the room. These people had lost everything. They had fought knowing they had no future left. And now? Now their princess stood before them, alive. Hope flickered in their weary eyes. Illyra straightened. "We don't have time for formalities," she said. "Are there any ships left?" Vaylor hesitated. "There's a single transport. It was damaged in the attack, but if we can reach the nearest jump gate dash." "It will have to do," Illyra said, nodding. "We leave now." The soldiers rose immediately, ready to follow. Ethan exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "All right, Your Majesty," he muttered. "Looks like you've got your army." Illyra glanced at him. "And you?" Ethan smirked. "I guess I'm stuck with you, huh?" Illyra didn't smile, but for the first time, her eyes softened. "Yes," she said quietly. I suppose you are. Chapter 4. A Future Forged in Fire. The battle was over, but the war had just begun. The hangar bay reeked of plasma burns and blood, the echoes of the last gunfire fading into the vast silence of a city in ruin. Alira stood at the center of it all, her silver hair matted with soot and sweat, her violet eyes unreadable as she surveyed the last remnants of her people. Ethan watched her, knowing full well what this moment meant. She wasn't just a princess anymore. She was the last of the Zyran royal line, the last hope of an empire that had been set aflame. The surviving soldiers gathered around her, standing at attention despite their exhaustion and wounds. Some of them looked uncertain, others filled with renewed purpose. They had fought thinking they were dying for a kingdom that no longer existed. But now they had a reason to keep going. Now they had her. And Ethan had no idea what the hell he'd just gotten himself into. The only way out. Captain Valor Reese, the highest-ranking survivor, approached Alira, his expression grim but resolute. There's only one transport left, he said, gesturing toward the damaged Zyran vessel at the far end of the hangar. It took some damage during the bombardment, but it's still space-worthy. Ethan exhaled. How many people can it carry? Valor hesitated. All of us. Barely. If we push the engines to their limit. Ethan ran a hand through his hair, eyeing the ship. It was an older model, meant for royal escorts, not full-scale evacuation. It would be a tight fit. And there was one more problem. We don't just need to get off the ground, Ethan said. We need to get past the blockade. Because the enemy was still out there. Their warships lingered in orbit, and if they tried to escape without a plan, they'd be shot out of the sky before they even hit the exosphere. Alira nodded. Then we find another way. Ethan glanced at her. You got a plan, princess? Alira turned to Valor. This is a military outpost, yes? Valor blinked. Yes, your highness. Then there must be a cloaking field generator somewhere in the lower levels. Ethan's eyebrows raised. You want to cloak an entire transport ship? If it's our only chance, then yes, Alira said. Valor nodded. There should be one in the command center. But his expression darkened. We lost contact with that section hours ago. If the enemy is still here, that's where they'd be. Ethan sighed, checking the charge on his rifle. Of course they are. The last battle for Eldoria, they moved swiftly through the lower corridors, the tension in the air thick enough to choke. Ethan took the lead, his rifle steady, his instinct sharp from years of navigating hostile territories. Alira moved just behind him, her energy blade in hand, her expression unreadable. Despite everything, the exhaustion, the fear, the weight of her people's survival on her shoulders, she didn't hesitate. She wasn't running. She was fighting for what was hers. And Ethan couldn't help but respect the hell out of that. They reached the command center just in time to see the enemy forces taking control of the consoles. At least 10 of them, their weapons primed. Ethan didn't wait. He fired first, his shots hitting dead center as 2 of the soldiers dropped instantly. The rest spun around, but Alira was already on them. She moved like a storm, her blade slicing through armor and flesh, her movements so fast they were almost a blur. Ethan kept her covered, firing with military precision, cutting down any enemy that turned their weapon toward her. The fight was over in less than a minute. Alira stood in the center of the carnage, her breathing heavy, her blade glowing faintly with residual heat. Ethan let out a slow breath. I'm never pissing you off. Alira barely smirked. Valor and the remaining soldiers rushed inside, taking over the controls. Moments later, the cloaking field activated. And just like that, they had a way out. Escape from a dying world. The transport lifted off as the last remnants of Eldoria Prime crumbled beneath them. The cloaking field held, shielding them from enemy scanners as they broke through the atmosphere. The view from the ship was haunting. Alira stood at the observation window, watching as her home burned. Ethan stood beside her, arms crossed. You did what you could, he murmured. She didn't reply for a long time. Then, finally, she whispered, It's not over. Ethan glanced at her. You still think there's something left to fight for? Alira turned to him, her violet eyes shining with something fierce. I know there is. Ethan let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. You really are impossible. You know that? Alira actually smiled this time. And damn if it didn't make Ethan's heart stutter. For a man who claims not to care, she said softly. You stayed? Ethan held her gaze. And in that moment, he knew. This wasn't just about getting her off Eldoria alive. This was the beginning of something bigger. Because Alira Valzyran wasn't just a fallen princess. She was the future of her people. And somehow, against all odds, Ethan had just become part of it. Epilogue, a throne reclaimed. Days later, their ship drifted silently in deep space, hidden from enemy sensors. Alira stood on the bridge, surrounded by what remained of her forces. The last of the Zyran loyalists. Her people. Ethan leaned against the doorway, watching her. She was born for this. And he had a feeling that, whether he liked it or not, he was in this for the long haul. She turned toward him, her expression unreadable. So mercenary, she murmured. Are you staying? Ethan smirked. I'm thinking about it. Alira tilted her head. And what would it take for you to decide? Ethan met her gaze, his smirk softening just slightly. I think I already did. Alira's lips curved into something dangerously close to affection. And as the ship prepared for the next step of their journey, Ethan knew Dash. He had just signed up for something much bigger than he ever bargained for. And he wouldn't have it any other way.